All right. So for the project, what I want you to do is, if you read the business model, what they're trying to do in here is they're trying to make, let's say the client comes to you and they says we are starting a business and we want to do business very similar to the Redbox or Netflix, where they want, what they want to do is they're giving the DVDs. It's not an online. They send out the DVDs to the customer, but they can go online and queue up the movies they want to get as a DVD in the mail, something like that. So it's not that they can watch it right away online. So it's more similar to Redbox, where you go in and take the movie out. So with that in mind, what do they have is, so if you think about if you ever rented the movie from the Redbox, it's very similar to that. And what do you do in here is, for the customers who comes to their client, they have mentioned what kind of requirements they have about their business, what they want to see from the data. That's the one thing that's in there. And then they have also explained how they want their business to be worked. So two things in here: how they want their business to be worked. So it means you need to think about when their business would be working, what information they're going to get from their customer, and where you're going to store it. And then second thing you need to think about, when the customer data is stored on your client database, what kind of analysis they want to do on those data that they are collecting from the customers. So the analysis is the part that starts from 1 to 10. This is more like analysis. So that's where you will be writing queries to do the analysis on the data. But before that, even you reach this point, you have to create the database that supports their business. It means they can run their business when the customer comes in. They can sign up for the plan, they can rent out the movie, when they return the movie, when they leave the plan. You have to think all about things. That's the thing before the analysis of the data starts. Okay, so when you will be making the business model, when the people rents out or they come and join in the certain plan, you would be storing the customer data. So if you see their business model, what they're saying is they have two plans. One is 3 movie at a time, and the second is 3 at a time, and then I guess 2 at a time. Okay, right? Okay, so 2 at a time and 3 at a time, I guess. Okay, and then they have the different rates for 2 at a time and 3 at a time. Okay, so it's like $17.99 per month and $11.99 per month they will charge. So you need to think about, when you're going to store the plan information, what information do you want to store with the plan table? Because the first thing that you would need a plan table. So let's say you have the plan ID 1 and plan ID 2. Plan ID 1 description is 2 at a time. Plan ID 2 description is 3 at a time. What's the cost would be another column. And then if you want any other detail about modified date, when this plan got activated, is this plan offered anymore or not? So you can have columns based on the requirements that you come up with the project. But at least you would need the plan ID, plan description, and then the rate of the plan, right? So now think about, when the customer joins in, they might go away as well, right? So let's say when they cancel their subscription, what plan ID they want you want the customer to put on. So let's say the customer comes in, he joins, and he says, okay, I'm gonna take the plan 3 at a time. So when he signs up for the plan, what are you gonna ask from the customer? First, you're gonna ask what plan are you gonna get. Once you click on the plan, then you start collecting the information about the user, right? What his name, what his last name, what is his address, where he want to get delivered the DVDs, phone number. You don't need much information, about the customer. You would need is the customer ID that you will generate in the database, and his name and his address. Okay, and then what plan he is on. So if the customer 1, he's in plan ID, which plan ID? So that plan ID will be coming from the plan table, right? So based on what plan they sign up, you're going to store the plan ID as a foreign key in the customer table, right? So and then the customer, so the customer signs up for a plan, and then what does he do next is the same customer add 10 movies to their queues, right? So let's say online you say what DVDs you have available. So what customer will do is he go in and he do the queuing of the movies, and he add 10 movies to the queue. So when when he is adding to the queue, you need to think about where you're going to store this information where customer is adding movies to the queue. So you would need a queue table. So let's say if you have a queue table, what would be the identifiers for the customers in the queue table? So let's say Adan goes in and he signs up for a plan, and he says, okay, I'm going to add these 10 movies that I want to watch next, one after the other. So when you have a queue table, what do you need to make sure that Adan queue will not get mixed with mine or with Victoria? What do you have to do? So the queue ID would be enough in the table, or would you need something else? So let's say you would need the movie ID, which 10 movies you added, but do you need anything else than queue ID and the movie ID? So let's say I go in, I add 10 movies. Adan goes in, he adds 10 movies. Now when you're storing just the queue ID and the movie ID, when I have 20 rows or 30 rows in the table, would you be able to distinguish between the rows, which one is for Adan and which one is for Andy, or which one is for Victoria? Would you be able to identify? No, right? So when the movie is added in the queue by the customer, you have to say for which customer you are adding the queue. So in the queue table, you're just not adding the queue ID, you would have to add the customer ID, because the queue is by customer, right? So you have to think about queue ID and customer ID in the queue table. So if Andy adds in, you add the queue ID, which is auto generated, and then you have to take my queue ID. So you have to take my customer ID from the customer table and add it in the queue table. So queue ID, and then you're gonna have the customer ID added, and then the movie ID that I'm adding in from the online, right? So you need to think about how you're gonna create the queue table. You would need the customer ID in there. Now, once you create a queue, what the company will do is they will send out first 3 movies in the queue, because it is 3 at a time program. Okay, so they mail based on the address they have mentioned when they sign up. They mail out the movies. Okay, you don't need to worry about tracking the DVDs or anything. Don't worry about those things at all. Like if it's received by customer or anything, don't worry about that. It's out of scope. And then the customer watches and returns the first movie to the back to the company. So when they return the movie, what do you need to do next? You need to give them the next movie in the queue. So when you get the movie back, what you need to do? You need to somehow identify that, okay, this customer ID, whatever the customer was, he has returned a movie. Now I need to check how many, on what plan he is. Let's say he is 3 at a time and he is renting only 1 movie. Then you're gonna, once he returned the 1 movie, you're gonna send it the another one based on the queue he has. So if he has 3 movies in the queue, you send out 3. But if he has only 1 in the queue, you send another DVD when you receive this one, right? So based on how many DVDs he is holding, hold on. Okay, so if I see in here, let's look at the structure for the table. You have a rental table where you have the customer ID and the movie ID. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to the queue table and you're going to say, okay, for the customer ID, you're going to add the movie ID in there and then say, when did you send to the customer? Why do you need to add the date? When do you send to the customer? So let's say you sent the 3 movies, you put the date for the day you sent. When they return the movie, you will put the date when they returned it. Okay, so let's say if the customer returns 1 movie out of 3, it means he can get 1 movie more. Okay, next time he returns 2 movies, you update the date in here for the customer date on the day you return, and you see, okay, now he has only 1 movie rented, I can send him 2 more. Next time he returns you all the 3, and then you find out how many DVDs he has nothing. Then you send, okay, 3 more movies from the queue you take and you send out to the person. So how do you know, let's say if the person, this is the question for you, okay? So let's say if the person has rented movies and he's returning and he's adding it to the queue, how do you know that how many movies he can get when he returns the movie? So let's say the person returned the movie, you go in and check the queue. How do you know how many movies you have to send him? How do you determine? Let's say he has already been. But let's say if he already owns two movies, how do you know? So first you have to find out before you can send him the new DVD. Does he how many movies he can get, right? How do you know? So from the plan says you can get 3 movies at a time, but how do you know how many movies he's holding with him, right? So think about this. Because he has 3 at a time plan, you cannot just send him 3 more movies. You don't know how many movies he hold right now, right? Let's say he returns 1, it doesn't mean that you can give him 3 more. He might be holding 2, he might be holding 1 movie, he might not be holding anything. So from where do you find out that how many movies he's holding currently, so that you can check how many more you can send him based on his plan? How do you find out? Where are you gonna look? Yes, how do you gonna look? How many are sent to him, right? Where do you gonna look? In rental table. So let's but how do you find out that? So let's say if he had returned the 30 movies to back to you, out of let's say he was keep getting and returning. How do you say that he is holding the movie? How do you determine which movies he is holding? How do you look for that record? Do you know what I'm saying? Because he might have taken movies and giving back to you. So you look in the rental table, but what you would be looking for? How do you look that he holds that movie to make sure that it doesn't return to you? How do you find that information? That the movie is sent out, but it's not returned. What would be the logic? So that's correct. You can look in the rental table, but in the rental table, you can have the movies that has already been returned. So how do you make sure that the movie he is holding is the only one you want to get? So you will be looking for where return from customer date is not populated, right? So you will be looking for only those records from that customer which is having the return from customer date null. It means it's not populated. It means the customer hasn't returned. Because what do? You sent out the movie, you insert the record in the table. When the person's return the DVD back, you update the date for the return date, right? So if I have to find out how many movies he is holding, what I need to do, I need to look into the rental table where rental date for the return date for the customer is null, right? So wherever the date is not populated, it means the DVD is still held by that person. So what you do is you find out the count, how many he is holding, and then you get the count for the movie or the plan he has. So let's say you get the count is 3, okay, from the plan table for the customer, that this customer is on 3 at a time. And then from the rental table you get, okay, he only holds 1 movie. So now how many movies you can send to him? 2. So you need to find out the plan, what plan he is on, and then you have to find out how many DVDs he is holding. You subtract that, and then okay, you get the number 2. Then you're gonna do, okay, in the customer queue table you're gonna go and you need to find out what are the 2 movies that I can send next. You're not gonna send 3, you're not gonna send 1. You find the number, and based on that number you will pick the movies, next 2 movies from the queue. Does it make sense? So this is gonna play a very important role. How do you insert the rows and how do you update the rows? Okay. Return from customer date. So when he returned the DVD, that will be null. So this will be only populated when you get back DVD. So you sent out to customer, you insert the record with return date as not populated. And then when customer sends back you the DVD, what you do is you update for that movie that he has returned, you put the date in on which date it got returned. Make sense? Oops. Okay. All right. Or do you want me to show it in the Excel? Okay. So if not, I mean, if it makes sense, then uh, okay. So now let's say the customer watches and returns the first movie to the back to the company. So you need to have a process when he returns the movie, how you gonna update that rental table, right? So you need a process. Okay, so let's say Adan sends back one movie. So I need to find out what's the Adan customer ID and what movie ID he's returning. So I get both of them, customer ID and the movie ID, and based on that I'm gonna update the rental table, right? Because it could be possible that what Adan movie has rented, it's not one with the company. They can hold the copy of that movie, multiple copy, So you need to make sure you just not update by the movie ID. You need to update by movie ID and customer ID, because the same movie I can hold as well. So when the Adan returns, you want to make sure you reflect in the Adan's account. You don't reflect in my account that I returned that DVD, right? Okay. So then this is that we talked about Netflix. The company mails out the next movie in the queue from the customer, which is the fourth movie he added, right? So you take the next movie from the queue and send them the DVD. Now the customer, what happens is, okay, he's doing the business and then he decided to close down the account. Okay, what do you need to do is when he closed the account and he returns only 2 out of the 3 movies. Okay, so he rented out 3 and he returned 2. What do you need to do is you need to charge $25 per DVD that is missing when he closes the account. So if he didn't return a number of movies, you find out from the rental table how many movies he's holding right now, and then you charge $25. When you close the account, you say, okay, I will be charging him this much dollar for the closing account because he didn't return the movie. Okay. So these are just not like the complete list. So if you read the requirements, it will help you more what things that you need to do in the database. So if you read the first requirement is about the director. So you need to think about where I need to store the movie that is directed by which director, So it's in here, it doesn't give you the idea that you need the information about the movie director, right? So this is not the complete list that only these things you would need in the database. When you read the requirement, you might need to add more stuff into the database tables. Okay, all right. So in here it says the rental history is, so the rental table that you're going to create will be used for 2 purposes: to give employee a basis to work from when they're asked what movie the customer has rented out, or if it was lost in mail. So let's say you're gonna track from your rental table how many movies is held by the customer. Okay, and then when you close the account, you will look in the rental table how many DVDs he is holding. Okay, so that's what you're gonna see if the movie is received by the company back or not. So that's what you're gonna get from, that's what you need to determine from the table. That's one of the goal of doing this project. So you would be able to determine how you're gonna count how many movies is held by the customer. Okay, so now these are the requirements you might have been through. It's nothing much in here. So everyone can come up with different table names. It's fine. Everyone can have the different data. That's fine. Everyone can think about what tables needs to be there. Some might come up with a few 5-6 tables. Some other can come up with 6-8 tables. That's okay. So based on your thinking, you need to decide what tables I have to create when I will be doing the creating the database for this client. Okay, so there is no hard requirement that you have to do this, but you have to think about yourself and start developing the project. Okay, so this is just the small model that we are talking about. It's not going to be exactly match what the real company Redbox will do. They're going to have like a very huge database, but what we're trying to do is we're taking the requirements and we're trying to make a small implementation of the real-time project. Okay, all right. So once you go through these requirements, you're gonna get more about, like, in the first one you have to get the movies by director. In the second one you get give me all the customers who are currently active. So you need to track in the customer table who are active. What do you mean by active? That they are enrolled in one of the plan offered by the company. They have not cancelled anything. So if they have cancelled, you're not going to count them as an active customer. So if you have to find out how many customers you have active in your business, then you need to find out a way how you're going to count that, or how you're going to find that who are the active customers, okay, who are on the subscription. So you need to think about how I'm going to mark active customers in my table, or inactive customers who left the who left or who canceled the subscription, okay. And then so you just keep reading from list from top to bottom, and then find out what you need to do. So the management, so these are the requests for the data analysis, the request for all the current active customers, as well as the name of the current plan in which each of these customers is enrolled. So it's just not the active, you have to find out on which plan they are enrolled in, okay. So that would be another query. Let's see. The customer requests the titles of all the DVDs that he or she has not rented. So think about how you're going to return all the list of the DVDs that you have in the company. So you might have thousands of DVDs in the company, thousands of movies, but the customer might not have rented all of them. So when you need to write a query that shows the movie by customer that they have not rented. So let's say out of 1000, if they have rented 50, you're going to show them only 950 movies. So how do you going to retrieve those 950 records of the movies that they haven't seen, okay. So you need to think about all these requirements, and then don't worry much about the indexes. We're going to talk through this about the indexes, the functions, the stored procedure. What I want you to start working on is creating the tables, defining the constraints on the table, primary key, foreign key constraints, and start putting the data in, because you know how to create the table, how to put the constraints, and how to insert the data in the table, okay. So start working on this one. Don't worry much about indexes, stored procedures, and functions, okay. Just try to create the tables and put the data into the table. Any question? Okay, so is the project clear? Is project clear to everybody? I mean, if you have questions, you can ask once you start working on it. I know you're gonna have more questions, so you can ask before or after the class when we meet next time. Once you're done with creating the tables and inserting the data, let me know. Then we can start talking about the next steps. So take about like a week or so to start at least finishing the tables, to start creating and finishing the tables. And then the second week you can think about adding the data in the table, okay. So in the first week you're going to think about what tables, columns I would need based on the requirement that is in the document, okay. All right, any question, anyone? All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to get back to where we left off in the last class. In the last class, what we were trying to do is we were trying to insert the data into the table. We are trying to create the table, right? We have seen how to insert the data, and then we started looking in how to create a copy of a table into a separate database, right? So that was using into. We have seen how to use into. So that copies both table and the data from the table that you are mentioning. But if you just need the table, we have seen you can put in the where condition and say where employee ID. So when the select query doesn't return anything, you have to write a query in such a way that it doesn't return any data. And then all you do is you put into in between. That would create a table for the employees with the same structure as an employee but no data in it, okay. So it's based on how do you put in the where condition, it's going to create the table structure and the data, okay. So we have seen that, and now the next thing that I was Once you have the existing table, how you're going to copy the data into the table which is the existing one, how it's going to work. Okay, so you know how to insert the data using the values, right? If you have the table, you can say insert into table name, and then you can say values, and you can do the values for the columns. But let's say what you're trying to do is you have an existing table called employee in your database. How can you insert the data into existing table? How can you insert the data into the existing table? From the query, okay, or from the existing table. Okay, so you cannot use into because the table is existing, right? You cannot use the into. So what do you do to insert just the data into the table which is existing table? So let's say if I go in here, I think I have the employee table. I don't. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a table which is empty, okay, in the database where I don't have anything. So I think this is the table that I have where I don't have anything. Yes, so this is the table that I have in which I don't have the data. What do I want to do is I want to copy the data from human resources.employee table, which is in AdventureWorks, into this table. How do you copy the data? You're not gonna sit and say insert into table name and then you're gonna type the whole 290 rows one by one and insert it. You cannot do that, right? So there is a way you can write a query select statement that returns the data that you want to copy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a select statement with all the columns that I want to copy from human resources.employee and all the columns listed. So all I'm doing is I'm writing a select statement to select the data from where I want to copy, right? So in here you'll see I selected all the columns that I want to copy. So it's giving me 290 rows from the table. So you know how to write a select in order to get the data. So once you write a select, all you need to do is you need to say insert into table name and all the columns in which you're inserting the data. So insert into table and all the column names, and instead of values, how do you used to do for the single values? You used to say values and then in the parentheses you start typing the values for all the columns that you have mentioned, right? But in here you don't want to do this way because you don't want to type the whole data for 290 rows. So instead of doing the values, what you can do is you can use the select query to insert the data. Okay, so everything is same when you do the insert, but instead of values, you're going to select the data from the table in all the columns that are mentioned in your insert statement. You're going to select all those and you run this select and insert together to copy the data. So if you do this, it's going to insert everything what you have in the human resources.employee into this existing table called employee. Okay, so instead of values, what I'm focusing in here is you don't have to have the values used. You can always get the data from the table or the existing table. You can get the data from the existing table. You don't need to necessarily type in the values and like insert row one by one. You can copy the whole. If you have 1 million rows, you can copy all the rows from one table to the other table if the table is existing. Okay, but if what happens if you run this query more than one time? What will happen if you run this query twice? It's going to insert the row 2 times. So the new table might, if you run this query 2 times, the new table will have 580 rows, which is double of this, right? So if you keep running the same query again and again, it's going to keep inserting the data from the other table to the employee table. Okay, so let's do this. What I'm going to do is my table name is employee structure. I'm going to copy the name in here in which I want to dump the data. So it's you have seen that there is no data in this table, right? Employee structure table. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, I would let the system to generate the employee ID by itself. All I'm doing is I'm adding only from the national ID number from the second column that I have in the human resources.employee. I would let system generate the employee ID column. Okay, so I say insert into, I have mentioned all the columns, right? And then I'm doing a select for all those columns that I have mentioned from human resources.employee, right? So if I execute the query, it's going to say 290 rows affected. So if I keep executing it, I'm just duplicating the rows in my database, okay, or in my table. So let's take a look in my table now what happened. So if I do select from the table, the ID might not be getting repeated. If you see, the IDs are not getting repeated, but the data in the table is same. It's just because you are not inserting the employee ID in here, right? So that's why, because the computer is generating, he doesn't know if you're inserting the same data twice or it's a new data coming in every time you're inserting. So the SQL will do is after 290, it will start with 291 to 580 and then keep doing this, keep increasing the number. Okay. So in this case, the employee ID is auto-generated. It will not be maintained with what you have in the human resources.employee. So when you're done inserting the data, it's not necessarily that whatever the employee ID 1 is in the human resources.employee would be same in here. It could be different, right? Because you're not copying the employee ID when you're copying the data into the employee structure table. Are you copying the employee ID in the employee structure table? No, just starting from national ID number, and the employee ID is self-generated. So it means that same employee can have two different IDs in the two different tables. In employee structure, they can have different employee ID, and in the human resources.employee, they can have different employee ID, right? Because you're not taking the same employee ID from the human resources.employee table. Okay. So now how can you make, if you have to insert the same employee ID, what you can do is you can remove the identity insert column, and then once you remove the identity insert on this table employee ID column, then you can add the employee ID in here, and then you can add the data from that table. Okay. So when you copy the data, you need to make sure how do you want to copy. Do you want to copy with the ID as is, or you want to create new IDs when you're creating a copy of the data? It's based on the purpose of your data. Okay. If you just want to create a backup, then you need the employee ID same as what's in the other table. Okay. Any questions? No, I'm not inserting the employee ID at all, because employee ID is an identity column, so it's auto-generated. I'm not inserting the employee ID. I will let the system generate employee ID. So the system can generate, because it doesn't know the Adance comes first or ND comes first. It's just gonna as soon as the records will be inserted, the employee ID will be generated. Okay, so they might not have the same employee in this table, employee ID in this table and in the human resources.employee, because employee ID is generated by this table now. You're not getting the same employee ID for that person. Sorry? Right? Okay. Because you're not copying the employee ID, that's why it can be different between two tables. But if you want same, then you can remove the identity column from the employee ID, and then you can add an employee ID column in here before the national ID number. You can add one more column. So in that way, you can copy the whole table as is instead of generating the new employee ID for the new table. Okay. I mean, you have the column. All you need to do is you need to put it in here as well in your insert statement. So you're gonna say, yeah, in here you need to say employee ID as well. You're gonna provide the value for the employee ID as well, and you need to do in the select as well. Then I want to provide the employee ID. I don't want the system to generate a new employee ID. Right? Yep. And then you have to make sure you remove. So if you do like this now and you try to run the query, it's gonna error out. Why? Because you have the identity insert on, and if you have the identity insert on, you cannot insert the employee ID because it's an auto-generated. So see, you're getting an error because you have the identity on the employee ID and you're trying to say, okay, I will provide you the employee ID, right? but the employee ID is an identity column, so you cannot insert the value for the identity column for now. So you have to first remove identity column and then insert the data with employee ID. Okay, and there is a property called identity insert on, but don't worry about that. We're gonna see that later on. But usually when you're creating the backup, I would do the whole table with employee ID, you know. But if you just need the data, you don't worry much about the employee ID, then you can just say, okay, I can leave the employee ID out, and then I'm inserting everything else from national ID number to the modified date. Okay. All right. So let's say in here, okay, so let's say what do you want to do is in here in this table, do you remember in the last class we tried to insert the data into the table? When you insert the new department name, it's going to take automatically the next ID that is available, 1004. Now let's say what do you want to do is you don't want the system to be to have the auto identity generated by itself. You want one of the department math to be 10111 10011. That's the ID that you want to give to this department. So if you try to insert the math in here now, what ID it will get? It will get 1004, right? So if you want the particular ID for any of the department or any of the values, what you can do is you can say this is the property that you can use in the SQL. You can say, okay, set the identity insert on this table, set identity insert on department table on, and then you insert the value, and then even though you have the department ID as a identity column, you can insert the value in the identity column. So if I try to run without this identity insert on, I'm gonna get an error. It won't allow me to do it because department ID is what? It's an auto-generated key, so I cannot insert the value. But I'm saying that, okay, allow me to insert the value for the department ID or set insert identity on. So I want to insert the identity values in the column. So now if I try to run this, say it worked. And if you look in the table, instead of getting 1004, it gets the ID 10011. Why? Because you had the set identity insert on, you would be able to define the value for the department ID column. Okay, and then you can set the identity insert off. It means now if you try to insert 1012 in here, you won't be able to do it because the set identity insert is off. So when the set identity insert is on, it means you're saying SQL Server not to generate the IDs. I'm going to provide you the IDs for those rows. Okay. All right. So you basically, that's how you turn your identity column on or off by this property on the table. Okay. So if you turn on, it means you can create your own IDs you want if it doesn't exist in the table. Okay, you can create your own IDs. It doesn't need to be in sequential order. You can pick whatever IDs you want, and then you can insert the data, and then you switch off. Once you switch off, it automatically gonna pick up the next row after the max ID. Okay, so with this property, you can insert the data into the table even though they have the identity insert enabled. Okay, so don't worry much about this one. You're gonna understand once you do the insertion, and you're gonna work with identity insert. It's just I want to show you that it's not that identity insert value you cannot insert anything. There is an option you can override the system and say, okay, I want to provide the value by using the property. Okay, any questions? Okay, so the insert is almost done in here. We don't have anything left for the insert. So we have seen how you can insert the values if you have in the table. If you just want to insert it manually, you can use the value command and then you can say insert into table name value. We have seen how can you insert multiple rows using value. All you need to do is comma separated. In the round parentheses, you will put all the values. It's going to insert the rows. Now, once you have done these two, the third thing we have seen, how can you copy the data from one table to the existing table, right? We have seen how can you insert the data with the table structure. So you're going to copy both. You're going to copy the structure and you're going to insert the data as well using the into command, right? So all you're doing till now is doing in the permanent table that you have created on the database. How about if you need a temporary table that is just for time being? You don't want to create those tables permanent on the database. You're doing something, you want to create a table, and then once you're done, you want to drop those tables, you don't want it. So what you can do is, you can create the tables like how you do in here, and then but you need to worry about deleting those later on, right? What if you create 5-6 tables and you forget to delete? It will be there in the database, right? And it will make a mess in the database. So what you do is, instead of creating a permanent tables in the database and deleting them later on, what you do is you define the temporary tables in the database. Okay, what you do, you define the temporary tables in the database. The temporary tables would be dropped automatically once it's based on what kind of table you have. Okay, so there are different kind of temporary tables that you can create in the database. You have the global temporary table that is at the server level. It means the table that you create is a temporary, but it will be available to all the users. Anyone can access it from any session. Okay, so the global table means it's available to everybody. The second is the local temporary table. It means it would be available to you only for the session. Now, how do you define the session? Each window is a session. So let's say if you create a local temporary table in this session, anyone won't be able to access it, and even you won't be able to access that table from here. Okay, so if you are creating a local temporary table in this window, you cannot access it in any other window. Okay, so no one can access, and even you cannot access outside this session, right? Okay, so that is the local temporary table. Now then you have a smaller scope of the table that is called the table variable. The table variable will be only available during the runtime. So when you are running the query, you create a table that will be only available when you run the query. It will be automatically dropped once the query is done. Okay, so the local temporary table will be deleted when you close the session. So let's say if you have created one of the table in this session, as soon as you close the window, the table will be automatically dropped from the database. It no longer exists. Okay, the table variable will be created when you're running the query, and once the query is done, it will be automatically dropped. So that is a table variable. So global temporary table, local temporary table, and a table variable that is just available for the scope when you're running the query. And then the last one is the CTE, which is a common table expression. And this is very important. One of the important questions that they can ask you, what is the CTE and how do you use the CTE? So CTE is basically, what you do is, the scope of the CTE is during the runtime. So let's say you selected these queries, and when you run, the CTE will be available only to the next query after. So don't worry much about the CTE. We're gonna see the real example because the CTE is a little complex than anything else. But CTE has a smaller scope than anything else. So as we're going from top to bottom, the scope is getting less and less. So when I'm saying scope is getting less, it means the accessibility of the table is going less. Okay, so the table is more accessible in here, which is at the top. The table is the accessibility of the table is going down. Okay, all right. So the global temporary table or the local temporary table works very similar. How do you do your permanent table? The only difference is you will put the 2 hash in front of the table name. So let's say if you have to create a local temporary table, what do you do? Or a global temporary table. First create the table. How do you create it? So how do you create a table? You say create table, and then you put the table name, which is, let's say you're creating a student table, right? student. So the whole thing is same. Then you're gonna put the column, and then you're gonna put all the columns that you have in the student table. This is how you create your permanent table, right? You keep adding the columns. But if you have to create a global temporary table, all you need to do is put 2# in front of the table name. So this will make the table global temporary table, and this will be accessible to any of the windows you have open or any other user. This table would be available. Okay, so this will work same as your permanent table, but this table would be gone when the server is restarted. So let's say if the DBA goes in and restart the server, this table will be automatically deleted. But the DBA they don't restart the server. The server is only restarted during the weekends or when there is a downtime. The server never stops. They keep running 24/7. Okay, so how does this table will be dropped is, once you're done, it's always a good idea to drop your tables. Otherwise, it will be dropped when the server will restart. So if you usually the DBA they don't restart the server for a month or so, or like 2 weeks, then the table will be there for 2 weeks. So it's not a good idea to keep the table in the temporary database because it grows. If you have a lot of data in the table, it's gonna grow the database size. So that's why once you're done, you try to drop the table like how you drop your actual tables or your permanent tables. So you say drop table name. Okay, all right, so everything is same. It's just these are the temporary tables and you cannot see it in here. So where I'm in the database, in this database, right? So if I create this table, can you see this table in here? You cannot see the table that I just created in here because it's not accessible directly. You cannot see it because these are the temporary tables. You cannot see these tables in here, but you can query them in here, but you cannot see those tables. Okay, there's no way you can see these tables. You created, you know which table you created, and that's accessible to you. Okay, you won't be able to see this table. If you have to see what's the table, you cannot see it here. Okay, because these are temporary tables, they don't make it to the database. They go to the temporary database in the server. Okay, all right, so the temporary table goes into the temporary database. Now what do you do with the local temporary tables? The local temporary table is the only difference is you just put the 1#. When you're creating a local temporary table, you're just gonna put 1#. So everything is same, but let's say if I try to do this, let's see, hold on. So can I access this table from the other window? Yes, because it's a global table, I can access this table from here too. So now let's create a temporary table which is a local one, which is with the 1#. So if I create this table, okay, let's see if I can access it from this window. Okay, in here, if you see, if I try to run this, I can access this table from here. But if I go to the other query window and I try to access this table, it won't be available. Why? Because this table is a local temporary table and the scope of this table is only in the session. So that's why you can access it here but not here, because it's a session table. Okay, so all you're trying to do is you're trying to define the table and how you're going to use it. Okay, all right, so if you need the table that to be used permanently, you're going to create the permanent tables. But if you need a table that you want to use across the sessions, you're going to create global table. But if you need a table that you need only in this session, you're going to create the local temporary table. Okay, it's based on how you're going to use the table, where do you use it. And then the last thing is the table variable. So for table variable, the syntax is a little different. The syntax is, instead of create table name, you're just going to say declare and table name directly. You don't need to say create table name. Okay, all you do is you say declare, because it's a variable, it's not a table. It's a table, but it's a table variable. So that's why any of the variables are declared by declare or initiated by declare. So you say declare name of the variable, which is your table, and then you say the type of this variable is table. Okay, so declare variable name and the type, which is table, and then you put the ID integer comma student name. So these are the two columns for your table variable. Okay, All right, so we are just trying to see how to do the temporary tables. Don't worry about it, how you're going to use it, where you're going to use it, but first try to understand how to create the tables and how to use those tables within the scope. What's the scope of the table? And now how do you insert the data into the table? The same way, any of the table that you created, local temporary table, global temporary table, or table variable, how you can insert the data into the permanent table, the same way you can insert the data into any of these tables. Okay, the local table, the global table, or the temporary table. So the table variable, what did I say? The scope for the table variable is when you run the query. So let's say if you do declare this table, can I access the table now? No, I cannot access it because the scope of this table is only at the runtime. So the query is run, it's finished, and the table is dropped. It's no more available. So if I try to run it separately, I cannot do it. But if I try to run this whole thing together, see, I can access the table now. Why? Because the table variable has the scope only in the query. So when you run this query, you can access within this query, but you cannot access it after. So once this query is run, it's done, right? It's completely ran. Now if I try to access it, I cannot, because during the query time this table is available, and after it's dropped. So if I try to access it now, it won't be available. So the scope of this table is only at the query level. When you're running the query, that's the only time you can have the table variable available. Okay, so let's see, if I don't insert any record in here and I try to run this, I can access the table. But if I try to access the table now, it's not. So whenever there is all the query that are running in one select statement, or once you're selecting it all together and running it, that's okay. But if you want to create a table first and then select it, you have to either pick global or local temporary table, either of them. Okay, you cannot run it separately. Now what's the advantage of having this table, the local temporary table, and the table variable? Because the table variable are dropped as soon as you're done, you don't have to worry about dropping, because these tables are not dropped even though you're done with it. So see, these tables are still there. So if you don't want to worry about dropping the tables and you just need it for a small scope when you're running the query, these tables are good, because they will be automatically dropped and they're not going to take much space on the TempDB, on your temporary database. Okay. All right. Any questions? Now, what's the use of these tables? When you're gonna need the local temporary table, the global temporary table, or table variable? So let's say, do you remember in one of the class we did a correlated subquery, and I told you, let's see if I can find that quickly. I think it's one of the, yes, this one. So see in here, I guess, yes. So here what do I wanted to do was, if you remember, we were trying to do one query and then we want to use that query in our subquery in the next one while using the access, right? So what did you do is, you first insert the data into a temporary table and then you try to access the temporary table in the next step. So you don't have to put the whole query in here, right? So to make the query simpler, if you have to do this in one step, what you need to do is, you need to put this in here instead of the table. But what you do is, so let's run this query. I run this query to get the employee and what's their current date of pay when they were getting max paid, right? So you did like group by and you get the employee ID and what's their current date of employment when they're getting paid maximum, right? So, and you have to match this data with your outer query, the same query. So either you can use the whole query in here instead of table, right? Use the whole query as in here, but it's not going to look good. So what you can do is, you can take this and you can put in instead of this one you can put the whole table. So it would be just one query. That would be the one way of doing it. Okay, but the other way would be, what you can do is you say, okay, what I'm going to do is whatever the data I'm getting from this table, I'm going to put in the temporary table. So how do you put the data into the temporary table? You're going to say into and the local temporary table that you can create. You can name it anything you want. You can just say, you can say this as an employee pay history table. You can name it whatever you want, right? So you create a temporary table called employee pay hist, okay, which is starts with the hash, which is the local temporary table, and then you're going to use that local temporary table in here instead of the whole query. So sometimes this query makes our code cleaner and look better. Okay, so you don't have to worry about if you have like one query inside the other. So if you have 3 or 4 level of nesting, reading the query becomes hard. So what do you do is you put that into the temp table, and then you use those temp table in your next query. Another advantage of doing this is putting in the temp table. This temp table can be used for multiple queries. So let's say this is one of the 5 or 6 queries that you're doing. You're going to use this one in each of them. Okay, so let's say if you're doing 6 queries and this is just the first one where you're using it, if you want to use the same table again, you can use it in your next query, right? If you don't do the temp table, you have to write the same query again and again, right? I execute this, so I can use the table that I created in here. Oops, I can create it in my first query, and then I can use it in my second query. I can use it in my third query. So once you've dumped the data in the temp table, the data will be available for multiple queries. But if you don't dump into the table, you have to keep running this whole query again and again. So think about if you have a complex query that takes a long time. Let's say if you run a query that takes about like 3-4 minutes. So it's a better idea to put the data from that query into a temp table and then keep accessing from the temp table. Okay, so you don't have to repeat the same query in each of the next 10 queries. You just use this query because you have dumped the data that you're getting from the query into the temp table, right? Is that clear? So the temp table are usually a placeholder for your data, where you can hold the data for temporarily, and you can use it later on, the same data multiple times or between the different sessions. You know, you have done some aggregations, you want to use it later on. You can put the data in the temp table and keep using that temp table. Okay. So the idea is, as soon as you're done with this queries, you don't want to keep the table. So that's why you create the temporary tables. You don't want to create a permanent tables. Okay. So that's the use case when you would be needing the table or the temporary tables. Any questions? No? Okay. All right. So let's see. So try to, I mean, the temporary tables are same as the creation and insertion of the data is same as how you treat your permanent tables. Okay. The only difference is the scope of the table. It will not be available if you come next time, the temporary tables. So it's just time being tables. Okay, that's it. But the insertion of the data and the creation is same how you do your permanent tables. Okay, so this comes very handy when you're writing your code for moving the data, when you want to take up the backup into the temporary tables, or you want to do certain aggregation, you want to store the data of group by into your temp table, and you want to use it in the next few queries, or just next query. Okay. All right. So now we common table expression, we're gonna hold on to that because I want to first do the other things, and then we're gonna come, because this is like one of the complex table expression that comes with. Okay, so don't worry about the CTE much right now, because that is totally different concept. You don't create the table, you use it something like this. That's why I'm trying to hold on it right now, because you don't create the table, and you don't insert the data into the table. All you do is just select from the CTE. So that's why I'm trying to hold off right now, because I'm going to take it with the other topic. Okay. Yep. So the CTE is, you don't create the table, you don't insert the data in the CTE. It's just used for selecting the data. So that's why. All right. So don't worry much about the CTE right now. Just try to work on global, local, and the table variable. Okay. All right, so now let's see. What do I want to do next is, how do you update the data? Okay, so when we were talking about the database, we talked about the 4 properties of the database: atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability, right? So I told you what is atomicity, right? The atomicity is, when you're doing the transaction, everything should happen or nothing should happen, right? So it means, let's say if you are saying, I want to deposit my money from my saving account to checking account, and you say $500 transfer, it shouldn't be, it takes the money from your saving account and doesn't put in your checking account, right? That's not a good. So the atomicity is that if the transaction is happening, it should take the money out and should put it in back to my account, the other account where I'm transferring. Or if it cannot transfer because of failure, it should put my money back from where the system took out, right? So either it should happen completely, or it shouldn't happen at all. That's what the atomicity is. So let's say if you're doing a big transactions on your table, how do you make the atomicity? How do you make sure the atomicity is there? So let's say if you have a table, okay, the student table, all right, in your database, and what you're trying to do is, you're trying to update the data in the table, but what you want to do is, if any of the update fails, so let's say you're doing these updates in your table, okay, how many updates you're doing? 1, 2, 3 updates in your table. If any of these updates fails, you don't want to do. So let's say if you run the first update, it's success. You run the second update, it succeed. But when you run the third update, it will fail. So what do you want is, if this one will fail, you don't want to update this too as well. How do you make sure that when this update fails, this shouldn't be happening? Okay. So before getting into the transaction, let's see how do you make an update, how do you update the data to the table? Okay. And then we're gonna see how to do the transaction when you're doing the update. Okay, so let's say what do I want to do is, if I want to update the data in this table where student ID is 2, I want to update their I want to update their zip code. How do you update their zip code? Let's say the student used to live in one area and then he moved to the other area. He asked to update the zip code from this to this. How do you update it? For updating the data, you say the update command works is update table name, okay? So you first say I want to update, and then the name of the table that you're trying to update. Okay, so first I will make sure I'm pointing it to the correct database. Okay, so now in this database I have the table called student. So I say update table name, and then I have to say set. In the set, you're going to define which columns you want to update. So I want to update the zip code. So I'm going to say set zip code equals to the new value that I want to set for zip code. So when you say update the table and then set zip code, what are you doing? You're saying that update the zip code to this one. Did you say for which student you want to do? No. So you, in where condition, if you want to update for only one of the student, you have to say where student ID equals to 2. So in the update, set, and where, in where condition you're going to define for which record you want to make the update. So if you do this and you execute, it's going to update the student ID 2 zip code to 405. Doesn't do it. What happened? Oh, it's in a different database. So let's see. So what I'm going to do is I have to make, okay, now that's correct. So if I run this table, I updated zip code. I was in the wrong database. So I updated it to 4050542, right? The zip code is updated for the student. What would, can anyone think about what would happen if you don't put the where condition? If you just say update table and set zip code to this, what's gonna happen? All of the students, yes. So if you don't put the where condition, you might be in trouble and it's gonna update all the students with the same zip code. Okay, why it's gonna do that? Because you say update the table and set zip code to this. It means if you don't have the where condition in there, you might be in trouble and you're gonna update everything to the same zip code. So make sure when you're writing an update, you have you're updating the data into the table or into the column, into the rows which you want. You're not updating the whole table. Okay. All right. Okay. So the where condition is very important. If you don't put the where condition, it's going to update the whole table. Okay. All right. So now let's say, how do you update the multiple columns for the same student? So let's say for student ID 2, you want to update zip code, you want to upgrade their grade point, and then you want to update the department as well. So let's say the student grade has been decreased from whatever it was, or it was increased whatever it was. You want to change the student ID to the grade, the zip code, and the department ID. He moved to the different department. How do you update all of these 3 columns together? Everything is same. You say update the table that you want to update, and you say set first column equals to whatever the value you want to set, and comma second column the value you want to set, and then third column the value you want to set. Okay, so you, in the set, you will put all the columns that you want to update. Okay, in set you're gonna put all the columns that you will update. All right, by comma, and then in the where, the same is the where condition, which student ID you want to update. So you say with student ID 2, and let's say if I change the zip code back to 848 or something. Okay, so I'm saying, okay, the student ID zip code is changed to this, his grade changed to this, and the department is switched to this. So see, this is gonna affect all the values for student ID 2. If I do this and I go back and run the query, see all of the 3 values are updated for this student ID 2, right? But you have to make sure you put the where condition correct. If you have to do for the any other student, you do it for the you just change the student ID and then you update those records. Okay, now when you are updating the record, make sure that you use the correct column. You cannot say in here, can you say update the student ID? So let's say if you want to update this student ID 4, can you say where name equals to ND for this one? Can you say this? Instead of doing student ID, can you say where name equals to ND, I want to update. So let's see, if you want to update the student ID this, can you say where name equals to ND? Which one would you do? Where you will say student ID equals to 4, or you will say where name equals to ND? What would you pick if you have to update the student ID 4? Can you write in the where condition like this? Huh? But do you see what's going to happen if you say where name equals to ND? There are two NDs in here. So if you run this query, what it will do, it will update the row for both of them, because it doesn't know which one you're talking about. So it's going to do update both of the rows to the same data. So what I'm trying to make a point in here is, whenever you update the data, make sure you're using the key that is uniquely represents the data. I mean, if you want to update both the NDs, this query is correct. But if you just wanted to update this student and then you put where say name equals to ND, this query is not correct. Okay, so make sure when you're trying to update the data, you pick unique columns or the columns that are primary keys, so you're not affecting the other person or other data. Okay, because if in here if I say where name equals to ND, I'm going to update two rows together, which I don't want. I just want this to be updated. So make sure when you are picking up the IDs in the where condition, it's just not that you have to pick the IDs, but you have to make sure the column that you are using in the referencing in the where condition is a unique in the table. Okay, unless you want it to be updated for all the NDs in the table, that time this query is correct, but else no. Okay, all right. So in the where condition, you always make sure that you want to update for a particular scenario. If you want to update for a particular scenario, are you picking the correct primary key? Are you picking the correct column, which is the primary key of the table? Okay. All right. So now what I was saying is, this is how you're going to do the update. So update is very easy. Update table name, set columns, and then where condition. Okay. All right. So now let's say when you are doing an update, if in here, let's say this update got failed, you cannot do the update, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to insert an SSN that already exists. So this update couldn't happen. This update failed because the SSN already exists. Okay. So let's say if I try to do this where SSN is equals to 1203. All right. So let's see. If you try to run this update and this update fails because of the violation. Okay. So you did these two updates, and what you were doing is you started within here. Okay. You execute this query, it worked fine. You execute this query, it worked fine. But when you execute your third statement, it failed. Now what do you want to do is, you don't want to change any of these updates, because these update already happened in the database. If you try to see and run the query, you see the student ID 2 has a zip code of this one. The student ID 2 has a zip code of this one because you overwritten, right? So what happened is, whatever update you did in here, it's already applied to the database, even though this failed. Now what do you want to do is, you don't want these changes to happen on the database because this got failed. How do you do that? For that, you have to use the transactions. To follow the atomicity property, you want this all three transactions should be succeed. Then only run this should affect the database. If any of these fails, you don't want to update the database. Okay, how do you do that? So for that, because it's a whole one transaction, you have to do this thing. You have to define the transaction in your database, which would start with begin transaction. Okay, that starts with begin transaction. When you say begin transaction, so let's go back one step back. Okay, when you are running this command, what happens is it will automatically commit it to the database. So what I'm trying to say in here, let's say you updated by mistake, there is no way to go back. So let's say in here, what did you do is you updated all the students with the same zip code. There is no way you can roll back the data. So let's say in your database you had 1 million students, and by mistake you ran this command without where condition. all of them get the same zip code. There is no way you can revert what the original data was. I mean, there's backup, you can take it, but there's no direct way you can do it. Okay, so when you're running the commands, it comes with the implicit transaction. It says begin transaction and it says commit transaction. It automatically comes with begin and commit. It means the transaction that starts will automatically commit. It means it cannot be rolled back. You cannot go back to what it was once you run this query. Okay, so what I'm saying is, for right now I'm going to do the transaction, but what I'm saying is, let's say by mistake you run this query and all the 1 million rows get this zip code. There's no go back from this point to have what it was. There's no go back, because what happens is when you run just one statement and you don't start with begin transaction, it has implicit begin transaction and commit transaction. The SQL server will automatically begin and commit. Once it's committed, you cannot go back. You cannot roll back what it was to what it was. Okay, but now if you want to control that, what you can do is when you run this command, before that you say begin transaction. Once you say you want a begin transaction, you took the control, the system will not commit the transaction. It means you can roll back. So if I have the begin transaction, what I can just say is roll back the transaction, and then you will see I did it by mistake, but if I see it now because I rolled back, it's no more applied because I rolled back and I switched back to what it was. So how do you do that is, you have to explicitly define begin transaction, and let's say you run this by mistake, that's fine, you can always roll back by using rollback transaction. Okay, but let's say, so once you roll back the transaction, it will go to state what it was. Okay, but let's say you do begin transaction and you update the query, and then you say, okay, I only want to update one row, and that this statement updates only one row. You look at the data, everything looks good. What you can do is you can commit the transaction. Once you commit the transaction, you're saying that, okay, the changes that I made to the database are permanent. I don't want to roll back. I don't want to go back to what it was. So once you execute commit transaction, the changes will be reflected in the database. Okay, but when you do the rollback, it will put the old value what it was. What was the before state when you updated the data. Okay, so the begin transaction gives you the flexibility if you do any mistake or you want the atomicity properties to be followed, you use explicit transaction. You use the begin transaction. You begin the transaction and then either you commit if you're fine with what the changes are made. If you're not, then you roll back the transaction. So it gives you the flexibility to put back what it was. Okay, so now look at this case. What I'm trying to say in here is, you're doing this 3 transaction, and these 3 transaction all goes together. If any of these fails, you don't want to update it. So let's say you begin the transaction. Okay, now the transaction is begin. It means whatever update you will run in here now, it's part of just the begin transaction. Okay, so let's say you do one update, it succeed. You do second update, it succeed. But when you run the third one, it got failed. You want to roll back what you did in here and what you did in here. So once you say the rollback, it's going to roll back everything that started after this begin transaction. So no matter how many steps you took in this transaction, everything will be rolled back. Okay, so from where the begin transaction start, all the steps you did will be rolled back. It will be converted back to what it was, not what you made the changes. Okay, so the begin transaction gives you the flexibility to have the atomicity. So because the last transaction was failed, you don't want to do these two, so you roll back. But let's say if all these become succeed, what you can do is you can commit the transaction. If you say, okay, all of these are success, then I do commit transaction instead of rollback, because it's all of the transaction happened and I want to commit it. I don't want to roll back once all is done, right? So you can have the commit transaction in there. So it serves 2 purpose. The transaction serves 2 purpose. One is the atomicity, and the second is it gives you the flexibility when you do it something by mistake, you can roll back. Okay, if you did something by mistake, you can always roll back. So the begin transaction is very good practice when you're working on the production database. When you're doing a production support and you're making the changes to the prod database, sometime in hurry you make mistake like this. You just run this thing. Once you do this thing, you will be screwed in the production if you don't have the transaction open. If your transaction open, you do mistake, you can roll back. But let's say you didn't open the transaction and you do this kind of mistake in the production database for a company, you might get fired right away, because they don't expect these kind of things to be happen. Because getting back the data what it was is difficult. It's not easy task. So that's why you always do begin transaction. You make sure what you intended to do, and then you make sure, okay, that's what I intended to do, and you do in your select, you find out, okay, it looks good, and then you commit transaction. Okay, now there is a disadvantages also. There are disadvantages of using this begin transaction. What are the disadvantages? You don't want to leave the transaction open for long. Okay, just don't do this. You start the transaction, you do some updates in your database, 1 and 2, and then you go on a coffee break. Let me come back and I will do it something later on. No, never ever leave the transaction open. Either do a commit transaction or roll back. Don't leave this transaction open. I will tell you what's going to happen. So let's say if some other user comes in and he tried to run the query, what's going to happen? See in here by yourself. If let's say this is some other user coming in and trying to run the query against the same table you made the update, this query will be keep executing. It's going to be running like this forever. Why? Because you have the transaction open, and the transaction is open, the other person cannot access this table. So that's why I was saying that don't open the transaction and go on coffee break, okay, or like leave the transaction open for like more than certain time. Try to close the transaction as soon as possible. You should know what you are trying to attend. So see, this query is still running. So see, it's saying executing in here, right? It says executing. As soon as I roll back the transaction, you're gonna see this will stop. See, this thing is done. As soon as I stop the query from there, it runs. So what you're doing basically, when you're doing the transaction and you're leaving it open for unnecessary reason, you are blocking other person's work. You're blocking the table. You're taking a lock, or you're blocking the table so the other person is not able to access it. That's not a good habit. So whenever you're doing a transaction, make sure what you want to do, you have the steps defined. Okay, I want to do this. If I don't get the result what I expect, I will roll back right away, and then I will troubleshoot why it's not working. You don't want to leave the transaction open and try to troubleshoot what's wrong with my query. No, roll back and then think calm and like take your time and then make sure your query is correct. You don't want to leave the transaction open. Rollback is always easy. Commit might take time. So let's say when you're updating the rows and you expected, when I run this update, I will be updating only one row. But if this updates 2 rows, it means you want to roll back. So you should know when you're running this command, what is the expected result out of this, what you're trying to get out of it. If you get that, you commit, else you roll back. You don't try to find out why it's happening wrong. You find it once you roll back the transaction, because you don't want to block others. Okay, is that clear? So when you use the transactions, it comes with blocking. You don't want to block other people. Okay, all right. So open transaction and close the transaction quickly. All right. So basically what does it do is when you're trying to update or delete the data, it holds the lock on the table. That's why what it does is, let's say if I update this with the begin transaction, it says ND has the lock on the table during an update, and that's why either the same user or no other user can access the table from sessions. Okay, so you have to have the different session. So if you go on different session and try to access the table, or the other user, they won't be able to access it because it acquires a lock on the table. Okay. All right. So There are different kind of locks. When you insert, when you update, when you delete, different kind of locks are acquired. We don't need to go into the much detail what kind of locks are acquired when you do update delete, because this is like internal process. You don't need to know much about those. But once you get once you're gonna do update, insert, delete, you can understand what kind of locks are acquired when you do. It has nothing to do with you. You cannot say I want to acquire this kind of lock, I want to acquire this kind of lock. No, SQL Server will decide based on what kind of statements you're writing. If you're writing update, it will acquire update lock. When you do insert, it's gonna do exclusive lock. When you're gonna do delete, it's gonna do exclusive lock. When you do select, it's gonna do a shared lock. So SQL Server will decide based on what statement you're writing, it's gonna acquire a lock, and based on that, it says what kind of lock it is, and if what kind of data will be accessible on the lock that you have acquired. Okay, so don't worry much about the lock in the SQL. It's going to be way further down when you start learning about the locks, because it's more like an internal process that you won't need necessarily when you're writing the statements. Okay, but you just need to keep in mind that you don't block the tables when you're doing the transactions. Okay, close the transaction quickly as soon as you're done. Okay, so I guess in here we have seen the updates, which is the basic update. In the next class, we're gonna see the advanced update, and the advanced update would be nothing but we're gonna write a select statement. So let's say what do you want to do is you want to join two tables, and based on joining of the two tables, you want to update something in one of the table from your join. So let's say you update person.contact, you want to update person.contact or employee table based on these two joins where the email ID is this. So let's say in person.contact you have the names and everything available, right? And in the employee table you have the employee information, which is birth date. So let's say you want to update in employee table based on the name. How would you do it? So the information that you have available, you want to update for a person name, you want to update for person, but you want to update in person.contact, or you want to update employee table in which the name doesn't exist. How do you update the data on the table in which the parameter that you have, it doesn't exist? So you're trying to update the employee birth date, but it's by name. You have the name. How do you make those updates when you have some data available in one table and some data available in the other table in which you want to update? So it's two separate tables. So this will be completely based on how do you write a select. So if you know how to use the joins in the select statement, all we're going to do is replace the select. Everything will remain as is from the from condition. We just need to replace the select star with our update statement. Okay, so we're going to see this in the next class. Make sure you refresh your join concepts when you make the joins. So all we're going to do is replace the select star. So first you write the select query, and then you make sure your query is correct, and then you replace the select star with the update and set, and everything will remain as is. So we're going to see this advanced update in the next class. Okay, any questions? Say that again. Sorry. What do you in here? Oh, right. Yeah, right. So that's uh so I'm not sure what you're trying. Can you? So you're saying that in the I know what you, you. Yeah, this one. Right. No, I'm not gonna teach the copy. I'm not gonna saying about the copy, I'm saying about how to update the data. You have the data in the table and you want to update based on the record in the other table. So you have now two tables and you're trying to update the data from one table to another table. It's not inserting the data. So in here we see is moving the data from one table to other table. Now what I'm saying is, let's say if the employee ID 1 exists in both the tables and you want to change the information from one table to another table. You just want to update. The record already exists. You have to update the data. This is about just copying from one table to other table. Okay, if you don't have the data at all. So that's an insert. But once you've done the insert and you want to update that data from the other table, how do you do it? So these two are two separate things. This one that we seen in the class initially was just purely copying, assuming that there is no data in the table that where you're copying. Okay, but with the update we say that record exists. We just want to overwrite what exists in that table with the update. So the data has to be there to update.